Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Robots and Red Tape. As always, I'm your host, Nick Schutt. Happy to have my friend Gurpinder Dhillon with me today. Gurpinder, how are you, sir?
I am doing well, Nick. Thank you for having me.
And thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. Today we're talking about, data infrastructure. And very, very, very excited to have that conversation. For folks that don't have the opportunity to know you yet, do you mind just telling me a little bit about, everybody a little bit about yourself, your background, and kind of how you got here?
Yeah, definitely. So, as Nick mentioned, Gurpinder Dhillon, I have been in this space, data and AI space, for the last few decades, I would say. When I graduated from university, I graduated with a computer science degree. But I realized very quickly that I don't want to be a programmer. I don't want to be in front of a computer all the time. That wasn't really for me.
Hmm.
So instead, I was very fascinated about how do we bring technology and business together. There was a gap at that time that I realized that technology organizations or teams weren't really aligned or didn't understand the business strategy side, the goals. In other words, why do we need to do this? They were really good at creating stuff that needed to be created, but there was that link as to so what? Why do we need to do that, and what benefit is it going to create for the end user? So I took on that role and I started in product management side of the business, where I happened to start in an organization that dealt with data. And I kind of fell in love with data because I quickly saw that in order for us to make any strategic decisions and impactful outcomes for the business, it always relied on data. You needed good data and context to make that decision to be successful and justify it. So I started working within the data space and I focused more on data-centric learning, data-centric decision making. And since then, I have been working within organizations that focused very heavily on data and data insights and context. Most recently, I joined a company called Senzing, which focuses on creating entity resolution capabilities, which, in my opinion, is the connective tissue of data. How do we bring data sources together in context so that we could understand what the data is saying to inform business decisions? So that is what I do as the head of data and AI ecosystem and partnerships at Senzing today. And as a part of it, I also, as I said, I'm always fascinated about learning about data and doing more with it. So I did some research and I completed my doctorate, which was focused on data as well. So what is the impact of not having good quality data on business performance? So I spent a couple of years doing that. And I also wrote a book recently published a few months ago, which again also focuses on, thinking data but acting AI, right?
Hmm.
So that's a bit about me, Nick.
Man, really appreciate that. Very, very awesome background. And so how did you first like find your way into data infrastructure as in that world?
It started with curiosity. I was always wondering, there's every organization that you deal with, there's a lot of data that sits behind different infrastructures, different platforms. Now, the curiosity came in when I had to make some business decisions. As one example, I would say is something as simple as I am dealing with, an organization or organizations within a geography, but I need to understand how much value those organizations or customers are bringing to my business, right? So I had to go around and gather data to figure out, one, who those customers were. Second, are they related? Were there any relationships between customers? Sometimes you have franchise subsidiaries and branches and things like that. And then what kind of products they were using, what kind of services they were using. It started with that very basic analytics and BI type of exploration, which then turned into, okay, so this is great information, but there's a lot that one has to do to gather all that information and bring it together. Because back then, we didn't have the infrastructures ready. Even I would argue today, we lack some of those infrastructures to really make those very quick, impactful decisions. But it started with that curiosity to see how far can we take data to bring context and make informed decisions from it.
Hmm.
And then from there, it really just, sort of went into, okay, so now that we have data, what else can we do with it? What kind of modeling can be done, right? So what kind of statistics, the algorithms that can be deployed on of it, and what happens when you don't have the right quality of data, right? What impact does it have on the decisions? So I got the opportunity firsthand to see that almost like an innovation and in a controlled environment where I could play around with it and do something with it and really clearly portray the value that good or bad quality data brought to the business. So it kind of started there. And then when it came to AI, then I sort of delved into AI. Again, I would say AI has been around for many years. It got a bit more, limelight or mainstream with ChatGPT as part of the Gen AI LLM. But I had been using, AI, I would say, even going back 5 to 7 years using machine learning algorithms, right? So, and the thing I basically realized from all this is that AI gets all the headlines, but the
Mhm.
real magic happens behind the scenes in the plumbing, right? So if your data house isn't really built right or is in order, then the AI the roof won't hold, right? Just
Mhm.
like a very simple housing analogy. So if your foundation isn't right, then you can't really have a roof that will hold. So that is the thing, that realization that came from that.
Mhm.
And I've sort of been working along that side.
Absolutely, because it is, and correct me if I'm wrong, I've heard that AI deployments are, it's that's like the last 5% of your data infrastructure. That sits on top of all your organizational data. And if you don't have, to your point, if you don't have that solid foundation, like that last 5%, which is let's say the shiny object, right? It's the flashy thing. It's the thing that more people can understand. It's just not gonna, because it's not gonna work. It's not going to be or work as well or as effectively. Is that right?
Correct. And there's a lot of stats that have been thrown around lately. And then the most recent one, two stats I'll share with you. One of them is from Gartner that said, research said that 75% of AI projects fail to show value. And then MIT sort of did a very recent survey and research which says 95%, right? So that is a huge number. So if a lot of these AI projects are not really delivering value or are not successful, then one has to sort of, dissect it and go behind and understand why is that. And when you do that, you very quickly realize that AI isn't just about technology. There's a lot more that needs to go in to create that foundation, as we just discussed. And if you don't have that foundation right, you can have the best and the most expensive AI sitting on top of it. And it's really just going to go into that, the problem we used to have, garbage in, garbage out. And now with AI, I would even argue it's like garbage in, but then garbage gets multiplied because it becomes, available so quickly within the rest of the organization with a lot of eyes and hands on it using AI. So that's where we stand. If you don't have the foundation, you're bound to have an AI that's going to collapse.
Absolutely. And the book you wrote, Think Data, Act AI, what does that mean to you and how should organizations think differently because of it?
So the book really came about from a lot of the research that I did as a part of my doctorate. I spoke to hundreds of organizations of all sizes. And but even as a professional, as I was working and I was dealing with customers and I was dealing with industry experts at events that I spoke at, one thing that became really clear about me that AI is a lot about mindset versus just technology. So I wanted to capture that, and I wanted to also help organizations that wanted to do AI, but they weren't sure where to get started. So in the book, I sort of create a framework, and every chapter ends with a real leader's playbook kind of checklist that says, okay, this is what you should be doing if you are thinking about doing something in the AI.
Hmm.
And, and the whole idea behind the title, which says, Think Data Act AI is really around before you start acting AI, which is what a lot of organizations tended to do now because of various pressures from the boards, from the customers, the industry. You really have to think about the data behaviors that enable it, right? Is your organization mature from data maturity perspective to actually undertake these AI activities and initiatives?
Hmm.
Before you start rushing into AI, you have to start thinking about how do you ground your organization and yourself in the data that they can trust, the
Hmm.
lineage that becomes important for AI to make important and informative decisions, and the most important, governance. How do you make sure the data is governed properly that can be used for decision making, especially if it's AI? Because once AI starts using that data, it kind of becomes a black box thing, right? If you don't have good quality, it's kind of hard to control the outcome.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And people talk about data infrastructure a lot, but for folks that don't know, like myself, I'm an amateur here. Can you define like what is data infrastructure at its most basic level and kind of build it up from the ground up? Is like, how does that even work in whether it's a large organization, a small organization, what have you? What is data infrastructure and how do you define it?
That's a great question. So, there's multiple terminology that you will come across when you're dealing with data. So, as you said, data infrastructure is one. You would have data architecture, you would have ecosystem. There's multiple things that make up the infrastructure, I would say. So, simply put, data infrastructure, think of it that as the foundation and the plumbing of an organization's data, right? Data and activities that deal with or pertain to data. So, this is a technical backbone. Examples of that could be storage, the pipelines, the compute, the APIs, the integration framework, right? So that all make up the data infrastructure that enable data to flow through the organization.
Hmm.
It's what moves data systems to users. So when you have a data asset that needs to go out for decision making to, let's say, a sales organization, infrastructure will enable that. It will offer that invisible structure that allows data to flow seamlessly. It could also be your cloud platforms like AWS, Azure, GCP, Databricks, all the stuff that goes with it. So that would be considered data infrastructure. And one thing to remember here is that without good infrastructure, you get latency,
Hmm.
inconsistency, performance issues that ripple everywhere within the organization if you don't get that piece right.
Hmm. Absolutely. So we're talking uh not just storage. So storage is a big piece of it. So where it all sits and how it sits there. Then we're talking about how it flows through an organization, who has access to what, I would assume as well,
Exactly.
and then in addition to that, how you capture additional new data as it comes in, and where do you put that and how do you organize it? Is that correct?
That is correct. And some people like analogies. So I often use this analogy. Think of this as like the plumbing and wiring in a smart home,
Hmm.
right? So if you don't have that right, then nothing really will materialize in the house, right? From smart activities perspective. So that all you said is exactly that, right? It's the data, how you store it, how you access it, how you make it flow through the organization. The infrastructure allows that.
Absolutely. And now I know you just mentioned these three. You mentioned data infrastructure, data architecture, data ecosystem. Are these distinct concepts or are these just buzzwords in different ways to say the same thing?
There is distinction to all three, right? So let's talk about that a little bit. So we just talked about infrastructure as the foundation and as the basic backbone. Now the architecture is the design and the governance blueprint. So think of that as a blueprint. So the architecture basically tells you how do I use this particular data cloud for this particular use case? And how am I going to feed data into it, right? So what is that blueprint, that map that needs to be created in order for my data to flow through all these plumbing, all these wiring, all these things that I have set? It's also about structure and standards. So the policies, the models, the framework that will ensure consistency and trust for that data within the organization. And it also could include things like, what kind of, like, it depends how deep you want to go and how mature your organization is. But the architecture could be very complex and very involved, especially if you're dealing with Gen AI, the large language models, which then will also dictate how do you handle data models? How do you deal with metadata? How do you
Mhm.
deal with the lineage, how the data is flowing and what source it's coming from and how are you tracking it? What are the governance frameworks that need to be put into place? Like, do we need data mesh? Do we need data fabric? It also dictates what kind of, to some extent, the infrastructure that you might need for a particular data to flow through the organization. So that's the architecture,
Hmm.
right? And if infrastructure, as we said, is the foundation, architecture is how you decide to build the house, going back to that same
Hmm.
analogy. Now, let's talk about the data ecosystem. So this is the dynamic environment. Think of this as the overarching thing. The ecosystem brings together the different tools that you need, the different data sources that you have, the AI models that need to be deployed, and most importantly, the people who use and manage data. So your
Hmm.
ecosystem now extends from just tools and the blueprint to the people and the processes that need to become a part of your data overall ecosystem, right?
Hmm.
So that's what the ecosystem is. And it's think of ecosystem as a living and breathing part of the organization where the business, technology, and data all connect to create outcomes for the business.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have the infrastructure that everything sits on. You have the architecture, which decides how it's all going to work and where it's all going to flow. And then the ecosystem involves the users and actually doing things and using the data for specific outcomes. Correct.
Yes, that
Awesome.
is correct.
No, and as you look at, and I know you've been doing this for a long time, and you've also consulted with a lot of organizations and spoken with a lot of organizations about their data infrastructure. When people start building or modernizing their infrastructure, what's the biggest mistake that you see generally?
So that's a very good question. So I would say the biggest mistake organizations make are treating these these projects as technology upgrades, right? So that these are just technology, initiatives that need to be undertaken and managed by that. But in reality, you really need to peel the onion and realize that this is a business transformation that we are going through. So therefore, it's more than just technology. It needs to focus on platforms that
Hmm.
need to be a part of it, obviously, but it also needs to focus on the data culture and the ownership. So this is where people tend to overlook because either they're not ready, they're not mature enough to have that level of infrastructure where people understand data and they have a fully built data culture, or where the ownership is clearly defined. So they tend to overlook that and then they focus instead more on technology because they feel like, oh, I can just buy this product and this particular platform and it's going to fix my problems, right? So that's a huge mistake that organizations I have seen make time after time after time. Now, what I have seen as a result of that also is that most data projects fail, not because of bad technology, right? The technology is doing what it's supposed to do, but because no one owned the business value. You failed to bring together the process, people, and the technology together. So these are the three key components of a successful data initiative and project. And if you don't do that, then you are going to have issues down the road.
Absolutely. No, and if you as you think about this, if you as you break it down into components, what are the non-negotiable pillars for you of a healthy data infrastructure?
Yeah. So when you are dealing with the data, I would even just go as far as saying you're just making effective business decisions and strategy. You need to have good quality of data, right?
Hmm.
So people that need to make decisions that need to use that data, and it could be in any form. It could be a report that goes up to the CEO, which
Hmm.
simply just says, these are my top performing business units. These are my top customers globally. Now, if you can't trust that data, then you're going to have a problem. So now that is definitely a non-negotiable pillar at the top of my list, I would put, right?
Hmm.
Now, the second thing is now, how about integration and accessibility? Can we connect and share the information easily across the organization so that they can use it? You could have a great, like the best report out there or a Power BI tool, but if people don't have access to it, if they have to go through a lot of hoops to get access to it, then where's the well? They're not going to see the value of it, right? So all the effort that you have put in creating that is wasted. So that's the second thing I would say is the capability and the integration and accessibility for that data asset that you have created. Now, the third thing, which goes along with quality, which also helps maintain and dictate quality, is governance. You need to be clear on who owns what. Depending on, again, the maturity of the organization and the business that you're dealing with, you could have tons of data sources coming together to create a very powerful dashboard.
Hmm.
If you don't have clear ownership and governance for each of the data sources,
Hmm.
then you kind of have this disconnected or disjointed output, which can't really be trusted, right? So people will not be able to see the information. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing is the context. Knowing what data really means, not just where it lives.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, what I see organizations do is that, oh, the ERP data is coming from this particular department, and that's pretty much it. It's not enough, right? You need to understand what that ERP data providing? What is the context for it that is going to be used in the overall picture that it's going to create for the organization?
Mhm.
So again, just to reiterate, the four non-negotiable pillars, in my opinion, are the quality data, integration and accessibility, the governance and ownership, and then the context that the data provides.
Yeah.
Now, if I go back, right, to that analogy that we use from infrastructure perspective. So I would say good data infrastructure doesn't just move the data, it moves the data and creates confidence. So it's that layer of confidence that gets created by these.
Awesome. Out of curiosity, all the organizations you've talked to, what percentage of them have a healthy data infrastructure?
Very few, very low number. So a lot of even so, I would say I have seen maturity to be a lot better in smaller organizations versus large organizations. And the reason is this, because the maturity depends on what you're trying to accomplish and do and how savvy you are with managing data. A lot
Mhm.
of organizations, especially large organizations, there is so much bureaucracy within the organization that makes it very difficult to have a good infrastructure in place that allows easy and trusted movement of data. So I don't know the exact number because I haven't gone down to that level, but I would say based off of my dealings, it's a very low number.
Are we talking like under 10%, you think, under 5%?
I would say 15%.
15% or so. So
Yeah.
15, and I would also guess that newer companies and younger companies are probably better than, say, just like the Microsofts of the world, or these other large organizations that have been around for decades that have, frankly, a lot of inertia and a whole lot more data, right? Am I right in that?
Definitely, definitely. And the other thing that I see with just going back to my earlier comment is that large organizations go through a lot of changes more
Mhm.
frequently than, smaller, mid-sized companies. So when that happens, the new leadership comes in, they want to change things. So even if the things that were working before sometimes get redone or restructured, which creates, going back to square one again, because they want to change some of the platforms, they want to change some of the processes, even people, right? So when you do that, you're kind of like restarting often, depending on the organization, right? But then there's also with certain organizations, you have people and processes in place for a long time, and there's a lot of reluctance to change. You don't want to innovate, right? So that becomes, well, if this is working, then why do I need to change? And if I change, does that impact me as the owner of this, right?
Mhm.
Will it have some material impact for me? So there's a lot of those cultural issues that go into the place into this process as well as the typical change management issues.
Mhm.
So those are some of the things that I have picked up on, Nick.
Okay. No, I really appreciate that. And I mean, it makes sense. You think of it, and Microsoft's probably not a great example, and I'm not asking you to name drop companies just because
Yeah.
Microsoft's a tech company and they
Yeah.
probably think about this more than, say, like a BNSF railroad, or or like an Exelon that does power and integration, right? Things like that. I feel like a tech company may be doing a little bit better, but still, like, I can't even imagine the amount of data that somebody like a Microsoft or a Google, or, even like, your local utility company that you're working with, that provides all your power and water has, and how they're probably not using it more effectively. Um, which actually brings me to my next question around mature data infrastructure. As like a user in a company, what does it feel like to the business user, and how does it change the dynamic of folks that are actually making decisions?
So in my opinion, I think the maturity should always be driven by the business objective or strategy, right? So you go back to the fundamental, what are you trying to accomplish? And to do that as a business, what kind of data infrastructure do you need to have in place? So some questions that, you can ask as an organization to yourselves is, are the business's users getting answers? Right? Is this data, that infrastructure that we have created, is it really facilitating and providing that context and output that is required by the business users instead of just being a data dump. Because what I
Mhm.
have also seen is certain companies, when a user says, I need to know from, like, let's use marketing as an example. I'm trying to do account-based marketing, And I would like to understand for my existing customers what kind of products they're using and what is the likelihood of them going to this new product that we're going to be launching, right? So I can be a bit more mindful of the ABM initiatives that I need to put in place. Now, what I have seen in cases is that you put that request in, and the data or technology team will basically give you a file. They'll package up a file and say, "Here you go," right? So to me, that is data dump. Marketing or the end user does not have the bandwidth and sometimes the skills to do something with that data. So they're looking for insights. They're looking for context. So that's number one, right? Are the business users really getting the answers from the data sources, or is it really just a data dump? And then
Hmm.
the second is, are we spending less time arguing about whose number is right versus making decisions on those numbers? Because that often happens as well. If you have multiple sources, well,
Hmm.
whose number is right? Is the marketing number for this customer right? Or is the sales number for this customer right? Or is the finance number for this customer right? So there's a lot of that bickering that goes on as well. And then the third thing, since we are in the age of AI, would be, are the AI models performing better? If someone is really as mature and they're using AI, then the next thing would be, are the AI models working as expected? And they're delivering what they're expected to deliver, and are we making decisions derived from those models faster? Is it really helping us? So those are the three things I would sort of attach to a mature infrastructure, right? And then finally, just to wrap that piece up, is when your infrastructure matures, meetings often stop being about reconciling data. They start more being about driving outcomes. And you'll be surprised how many times I have been in organizations talking to them where the majority of the time in a, let's say, 2 hour meeting is spent around just arguing about, hey, my number is right, your number is wrong. No, this is how I define this particular attribute versus how you're defining it. So all that often stops happening, and you're focused more on utilizing the data to make decisions.
Absolutely. No, 100%. And what are you know, when you look at being AI ready from a data infrastructure perspective, what are the three things that you're looking for? And how do you know when an organization is actually ready for AI implementations?
So, so let me go back for a second to the fundamentals again that we talked about, right? So remember, AI is just another evolution of various technologies that we have been using for a while. So we talked about machine learning, even using computers for business intelligence, the Power BI and tools like that. So the basic foundation still needs to be strong for AI, as it needed to be for different projects that we undertook before in analytics. But what I would say here is that they have become a lot more essential and important when it comes to AI now, because again, my earlier comment, garbage and garbage multiplied
Hmm.
is more prominent now with AI than it was before. So when you're thinking about getting, the AI ready infrastructure in place, you need to think about, is the data connected,
Hmm.
right? I have multiple data sources. Are they talking to each other? Do I have this comprehensive collective view,
Hmm.
using customer as an example? So if I'm using my customer in this AI initiative, do I have that holistic customer view? And
Hmm.
this is where entity resolution, as I said earlier, plays that connective tissue role, right? So bringing it all together, the data is connected is the first one. Metadata is managed. A lot of the context comes from the metadata about the source, right? So, and the sources that you're dealing with. So, is the metadata managed properly? Do I have someone who's taking ownership to ensure that my labels and all the things that are required for this AI model to work correct and managed and updated? The governance piece becomes extremely important, and you need to make sure that, is the governance automated as opposed to someone having the ability to manually make changes to the governance policies. It becomes important for the AI to work efficiently, that there's some level of automation for governance as well, right? So, and I'll give you one example. If you are using data governance policies that dictate that, if there is some sort of, there's a risk tolerance that is defined for a particular data source, if there is a change in that tolerance. So, for example, my data quality degrades by 10%. What happens, right? Is my automated AI governance policy going to now create alerts for different organizations and owners that will then go in and make a change. So that level of automation from governance perspective becomes essential for the AI to work. And
Yeah.
ultimately, if you're a lot of people still think about AI readiness and associate with that technology, the large language models and the gov and the machine learning algorithms and the data science. But it really isn't about just those and the GPUs, right, that go into creating and making AI work. It's about clean, connected, and contextual data that'll ensure that you have an AI ready infrastructure.
Absolutely. And I love that you brought up entity resolution and that bring that in as a connective tissue. Taking this out of the theoretical into like a real world example, can you give us one or two that are, cases or things you've seen where entity resolution has you've been able to come and use that as a tool to drastically improve performance and outcomes?
Yeah, definitely. So there's multiple use cases that entity resolution fuels, right? So one of them we talked about sales and marketing. You want to understand who you are marketing to. What I have seen, especially in my research when I was doing my doctorate, is that companies spent millions of dollars. One organization I spoke to, they actually spent $1.5 million marketing to the wrong customers. And
Oof.
what happens was they created a new product which they wanted to take to market, but they wanted to only target customers that did not have that product. And then they were not a part of the early adopter program or any of that. So they wanted to go to this prospect universe. But what they forgot to do is bring together, they have a very comprehensive early adopter program where they actually enrolled customers and they offered them discounts and things like that. And then they forgot to do entity resolution to bring those two data sources together to eliminate the duplicate. So what ended up happening is they were using direct mailing campaign for this. So they spent a lot of money on creating this offer because it was a high-end product, and they marketed to everyone. And they marketed to this new prospect universe with a special price versus some of the existing ones that were already a part of the program. So one, they ended up spending a lot more money than they needed to on mailing and creating all this customer experience journey. And then second is it created customer dissatisfaction because all those customers that were already using this product as a part of early adapter program, they felt like the company didn't know them,
Yeah.
right? So they were still targeting them as new customers while they were already using it. So
Hmm.
they ended up losing not only just money on the cost, but also from satisfaction perspective, where a bunch of them said, you're not taking the time to know who your customers are, so therefore we don't want to be on this product or with you guys, right? So that's one example. And when you talk about risk and compliance, it's extremely important that you know who you are dealing with, right? Especially now when there's so much fraud out there. If you think about financial and banking sector or insurance sector, you need to be very quickly able to identify whether the activity that you're doing with someone is fraudulent or not. And
Yeah.
how do you do that? You need to look at multiple data sources, not internally, but you also need to look at external referential data sources as well. And one example I will give you is that there's a lot of watch lists, right? If you want to make sure that you're not dealing with someone who is on a watch list or a prohibited list of companies that you can do business with, you can get fined. There's a lot of fines that can be levied upon you from the government if you're dealing with a particular entity that you shouldn't
Mhm.
be dealing with, right? They're on the watch list. So entity resolution is what really helps you bring it all together. Now,
Mhm.
in terms of AI, because AI by its nature is automated decision making, right, to some extent, if it does not use entity resolution, it becomes very hard for AI to effectively make those decisions. And that's where hallucination comes into play as well. When AI is not able to very concretely say that this is how I need to drive this decision, then it's going to start making things up. And
Yep.
that's where you fall into a lot of traps and problems. And again, going into privacy issues, the laws and regulations.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you see that with, I know that there was just something happened with the Australian government that Deloitte delivered a report that they didn't read that had AI generated that made up the sources. I know I've seen, I think the HHS here in the United States did that at one point earlier this year where they had published this big report and they just didn't check the sources. And so, and then I know I've seen cases where like lawyers have presented briefs, and they completely invented all of the or the AI completely invented all of the the case law associated with it, or used case law and interpreted it incorrectly, where one of the cases that they're trying to use to prove their point actually disproved their point. And so is no, I'd assume a lot of these are based on public models more than internal models. Are these things that like entity resolution or better data quality could have solved? Or, is this something that is just going to be inherent within AI until, just in general?
I think there's you have to maintain a balance. So some of that definitely going to exist, right? Because that's
Hmm.
just the nature of the AI, because we are after giving AI so much control that it starts thinking like a human. So
Hmm.
if you think from that perspective, then human thinking has flaws as well,
Yeah.
right? We don't always make the right decisions. So if that is the case, then AI inherently will also exhibit that. But in my opinion, we want to make AI better than humans because we want to take those flaws out by
Mhm.
using multiple ways of guardrails that we can put around. Now, you can prevent, especially in the business context, a lot of that, right? And this is where the transparency and responsible AI comes into play. You can't really take it at face value. You need to look at a large language model and you need to put context around it as well. So you have seen the evolution where you have the RAGs, the agents, and things like that. So I think we're making progress, but if you really want to use AI in business context, we still have some work to do. And in my opinion, and I have a very strong opinion of that, is if you want to use AI in the context of dealing with customer, vendor, supplier, these type of entities, then entity resolution has to be a non-negotiable part of it, right?
Mhm.
Because if you do that, then you're eliminating a lot of those hallucinations because you're telling it, I am basically not asking you to make this decision whether this company is related to this company or not. I'm telling you this company is related to this company. Now take this information and layer on top of it whatever context needs to be layered to market to that company, right? So you're basically controlling AI. So human in the loop is an extremely important component that needs to be a part of business AI going forward, in my opinion, in order for it to work.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. I think that how you to your point earlier, I think the outcomes that you're looking for, you should work backwards from there and decide what tools you need to use, right? I think that anybody anytime you're touching anything public facing and you're using AI to communicate out as your company, you really need to be very, very careful. And you need to make sure that it has all of the right data, and that it is resolved properly. Because I would be super embarrassing, and it's super wasteful also, right? Like it's super wasteful then to spend company resources doing things like marketing to people that already have your product, right? That's just crazy to me. Makes sense, but like I can see how that would happen. But how can you balance the need for um driving innovation with having reliable data and reliable AI pipelines?
Um, I think what you need to do is you need to go back to, again, what I said earlier, which is what exactly are you trying to accomplish here, right? What you're trying to do sometimes, depending on your strategy and goal, you could be looking to do something that can be addressed by a very simple analytics project, which is, traditional proven analytics using stats, regression models and things like that, right? So if you start like that, where you're sort of saying, okay, I'm trying to accomplish this, and then you let the tools and the capabilities define the approach that you're going to take, almost like that architectural blueprint that we discussed, then you can limit the risk factors that are introduced by new technology like AI. But
Mhm.
you also want to innovate because there's a lot of pressure from boards and things like that where, okay, so we have to use AI. Now, my recommendation would be so you start from the basics and then you evolve that. Now, I have this as my starting point. What else can I put on top of it, which is controlled, right? That allows me to innovate and think about it, but at the same time mitigate risk that is associated with it. And then the third thing is testing, right? Before you roll it out and make it available to the wider audience, you test it out as much as you can to eliminate any hallucinations. If there's any hallucinations, how do you control that?
Hmm.
So, in my opinion, that could work as a vehicle for innovation, but also stay very vigilant and mindful of the risks that are associated with the innovation when you're trying, especially in these new technologies.
Hmm. And how do you explain the value of data infrastructure to leaders that are only really looking at like ROI on a very short-term basis?
So, well, first of all, you have to get out of that mindset, right? So you have to look at how are my decisions going to improve my company's well-being in the long run, right?
Hmm.
So every time you start thinking short term, you're kind of stifling innovation, right? So you have to think long term, and you also have to consider there's going to be some failures, some pivots, and things like that. So it comes with the data literacy as a component for the leadership team as well, that they need to understand the importance of data. Why is data essential for me to make decisions? And how is that going to turn my business with the highly profitable business so the ROI can be proven out? And oftentimes tie data investments to time to insight or revenue growth, not to short-term KPIs that you would typically consider from a business outcome. Like, public organizations, they look at KPIs that are on a quarterly basis. When
Hmm.
it comes to these type of initiatives, they have to go beyond that. They have to go for the year, sometimes a couple of years. But you have these milestones that are defined to help you understand, okay, so by this time I should be expecting this level of efficiencies. By this time, I should be looking at saving cost from this particular manual process that I'm doing. So if you put it in that framework, I think it'll be easier for the leadership to understand and adopt this mentality versus always thinking short-term gains.
Okay. Yeah, so it requires a fundamental shift because infrastructure is a longer term investment, right? But it's also building the foundation. And like I take that approach in general in my
Mhm.
life, right? As I look at all of these yeah, like and I've done this with every company I've ever started, and I've started a number of them. Is I'll spend the first 3 to 6 months setting up the infrastructure, like getting the LLC in place, getting all of the, all the vendors set up that you're going to need, figuring out your exact like, and kind of understanding exactly what we're supposed to be doing. Because every time that there are times where I'm like so busy that I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing, and it's always back to fundamentals, right? Like, all right, let's do just back to the fundamentals. What do we need to do? But if you don't know if your fundamentals aren't strong, then you don't really have much to go back to, right?
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I don't know if you're a basketball fan, but Mr. Fundamental, Tim Duncan, I mean, he's a Hall of Famer, right? He wasn't the flashiest player. He didn't care, like, but he was also highly, highly, highly effective.
Exactly. Yeah, the fundamentals never fail, in my opinion, right? The fundamentals are there for a reason.
Mhm.
That's why we call them the fundamentals.
Right.
So,
Absolutely.
which applies to, the data and AI space more than anything, because in technology, the thing with technology space is that, we tend to layer things one on top of another, right? So the foundation, the fundamentals become extremely important, which is why I emphasized earlier is that even when you're thinking about AI, data and AI, you compare that to what you did, let's say 5, 10 years ago, when, it was just about data, when companies started collecting tons of data. What did you do with that data, right? You started with the fundamentals there as well. You needed to clean the data. You need to make sure the quality was correct so that you could create a report, even if it was in Excel, right? So the data, the foundation has to be right. And the same is true now with AI and data management, the MDM, all these other things that we are layering on top of it. The fundamentals still hold true.
Mhm.
So we can't forget those.
Absolutely. What role do you think synthetic data and AI generated data is going to play?
So that is an area we have to be very careful with. And what say, based off of what I have seen, is you should always start by saying that or thinking that synthetic data can never really be a replacement for real data, right? Because There are so many use cases that companies are faced with today, and some of those can never really be done through synthetic data, and vice versa. There are some new emerging use cases that might require synthetic data. So one should always strive to get real data when possible, right? To get a fully representative sample of what you're trying to accomplish, so that that AI is built on actual facts versus fabricated facts.
Hmm.
But it is also understandable that in certain scenarios that we may not be able to get real data. So you have to start using some sort of like AI generated or synthetic data as a proxy, right? But always as a proxy. So, and some of the areas where synthetic data can fill those gaps are, for privacy, scale, and simulation. So
Hmm.
I know that synthetic data is used a lot when you're thinking about computer vision type of training models, like, the self-driving cars are using, because you can't always have the real data, right? But if you have sample data, you could create synthetic data to allow the system to do that. But in business world, however, I would say try to stay away as much as possible from synthetic data because there are so many edge cases that we come across on a daily basis that I don't think can really be represented by using synthetic data. Now, if you have a scenario where data privacy, for example, right, prohibits from collecting or using data for certain types of things, then synthetic data might be an option for us there.
Okay. No, that makes sense. So hyper specific cases where you have not enough data is a good one. Something I've always it's something I've been wondering about for a while, Gurpinder. Actually, as you look at the increased amount of AI generated content on the internet, right? And you look at the fact that like OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, everybody is using the internet to train their AI models. Uh, how do you, is there a way that they can essentially have their algorithms recognize their own generated content and filter that out as they continue to train further? Because as I think about it, I think that like with all of this AI generated stuff on the internet, that is like that's not, to your point, that's synthetic data. That's not great data to continue to train on. How do you think these large, generative AI companies are thinking about that or approaching that?
I think that's challenging, right? Especially when you are trying to train a system to mimic human and real behavior as much as possible, then how do you distinguish between what is real and what is not, right? So that gray line becomes, gets formed there. One thing I would say from the large language models, all these companies that you mentioned, they're obviously creating large language models. And the large language models would in a lot of cases use a mixture of real data. I would say majority of the data in those cases would be the real actual data versus, synthetic or generated data. Now, the other thing they're also doing is they're actually using user input, right? So
Mhm.
supervised learning and user trained models is another thing that they're going after now, which is why when you go as a user into your settings, you have by default they select the option that they're going to use your interaction to train the models.
Mhm.
Right. So they're using that. Now, how would they? I'm sure they're thinking like, those are very smart people. So they're thinking of ways to distinguish between what is real, what is synthetic, and to what extent statistically they could use it to still mimic a good real output from that model. So I would leave it to them, but from my opinion, there has to be some sort of like a threshold that gets created, which says I can only use this percentage of synthetic or generated data versus real in order for the system to act and feel like a real AI, like a human type of AI versus just in artificial intelligence.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. And I think it's going to continue to get worse and worse, right? And as there's just more and more and more and more data or content that has been generated, and whether that's images or videos or actual written content, it doesn't matter. It's all and I'm not really sure how you'd go about approaching that. I was just curious if you, I don't know,
I
how
think
you would approach it. I don't know.
I think transparency would be the other piece, right? Where you are able to, so if the for example, a lot of businesses are not really fully able to utilize these large language models because of the lack of transparency, right? In order for us to make decisions, we need to understand how we got to that decision. And a lot of AIs lack that, but there's a lot of emphasis and investment going into that transparency so that the large language model can tell you, I'm saying this because of this, right? So that's also where the RAG comes into play. So I think that that would be another way, Nick, where where these organizations could say, okay, so in order for me to make this decision, I used these attributes, these types of data sets, and then one can decide whether that's real or synthetic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I heard something where a friend of mine was telling me a while ago that he thought that, if you could, say group the entire English language into two or three groups, right? And then have the model generate on in a specific pattern, right? So that then your model can recognize the stuff that it has generated within a certain margin of error, and then filter all that out would be interesting too. But I'm not sure how if that would even be doable.
Exactly. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know. I'm not, that's these are, I'm just asking questions, man.
I was gonna say, we'll leave that for them to worry about.
Absolutely, 100%. How do you see data mesh evolving? Do you think that's like a blueprint for the future? Or do you think it's just a passing fad?
Data mesh is very interesting. It's so just for those people that may not know what data mesh is, right? So the traditional centralized model, for example, data warehouses, lakes, that we had before in the data infrastructure, they created bottlenecks. Data teams became gatekeepers of that instead of enablers. So, and the business teams, for example, got frustrated because they had the data but couldn't access or trust it quickly because it was controlled by the centralized department. So data mesh emerged as a way to balance that, the speed with the trust. So it basically allowed federating responsibility, but still enforcing global standards, through various governance and interoperability capabilities that organizations introduced as a part of it. So that's what really data mesh is. It's the ability to decentralize and make data available faster to the end user.
Hmm.
Where is it headed? To your question, the concept is still very sound, but the execution is hard, in my
Hmm.
opinion, what I have seen, right? A lot of companies want to create a data mesh, but it becomes difficult because now you're trying to create more decentralized infrastructure within an organization, and then it comes back to the skills and the connectability and all the other stuff that goes with it, right?
Hmm.
Many companies jumped on the term before fixing the fundamentals that we were just talking about, right? So the fundamentals still hold true even in a data mesh
Yeah.
infrastructure. So the fundamentals like the metadata, the lineage, the ownership. So they ended up with this distributed chaos, in my opinion, not a real mesh, because
Hmm.
people were still trying to figure out, okay, so marketing owns this particular data. How do I fix it? How do I make sure that it's going to the mesh in the right way so that it's still being controlled by the centralized repository? There are organizations that are also doing it well. And think of large scale enterprises or digitally native organizations that have a strong foundation in data governance and literacy. So any organization which have gotten the fundamentals right, they could really leverage data mesh to its best capability. So
Hmm.
in practice, I would say it's evolving. I hear about it a lot. I hear that people are implementing it or using it. So
Hmm.
it's definitely not a fad, in my opinion, but
Hmm.
it's not fully realized either at this time,
Yeah. No, that
right?
makes sense.
Yeah. So that's the way I would answer that. But then one last thing I would say on this particular topic is that it's less about architecture, in my opinion, but more about accountability
Hmm.
of the data, right? So the architecture is basically similar to what we discussed before, but where it becomes a bit more real is the accountability. Who is owning the accountability for the different pieces?
Makes sense. Yeah, so it's putting the data in the right people's hands. But again,
Yeah.
if the underlying fundamentals and the foundation are broken. It doesn't matter. It's just going to be more chaos. But that makes a lot of sense. And it also does make sense that as data continues to become more important, that you would want to put it in the right people's hands. But then I mean, that's an added job for them. It's a lot of work. And yeah, it's still, if your infrastructure is garbage, it's not going to change it. It's not going to make it better.
Yeah, and I think, Nick, one thing I would say, just thinking about all the evolutions and things that are happening in the data space, I would say is over time,
Hmm.
the data mesh principles will simply blend into how modern organizations operate, right? It'll become a part of typical operations. We won't even call it a mesh anymore. It'll just be the way of good data organization.
Hmm. Absolutely. And if you could build a data, like your ideal data infrastructure from scratch, right? And no budgetary limits, there's no legacy tech you need to work with, nothing. What would that look like?
So if I could start from scratch, I would build an infrastructure that basically learns as fast as the business changes, right? Because ultimately, going back to one more time, fundamentals. Why are we doing this? We're doing this to make a business user's life easier. So
Hmm.
I would want to implement and create an infrastructure that makes information readily available to the end user, but it's information that they can trust without thinking twice about the accuracy and the quality of it. So to do that, my ideal infrastructure would include cloud native infrastructure,
Hmm.
which is meta driven, it is entity aware, and it includes privacy first architecture, right? So, especially as we deal with the sensitive data. So all of that gets stitched together, through an entity aware capability. It's AI augmented governance so that I don't have to rely too much on manual policy changes, procedures. It's being handled by AI, but it's being alerted as needed, having that human in the loop capability.
Hmm.
And then the final design, I would say, would have to be a human-centered design for the business user. So you can never really, I would never want to really create a fully autonomous AI infrastructure. I would always want to keep a human in the process. It'll be a human-centered approach. So if there's issues, then there will be issues because we're not ready for AI to take over this stuff yet.
Hmm.
Then there is someone who's accountable and can be logical about what needs to happen to fix it.
Absolutely. No, I like that. I like the AI augmented because I'm with you. I don't think the AI is there, and I don't think we necessarily really want to give up that kind of control. Um, no matter what, I think that's kind of how you get Skynet, right? Is you start giving up control and decisions to the AI. And I know we're far, far away from that by, leaps and bounds from that happening. But I think as we're building an AI native society, which is what I think we're kind of going through now, and a
Mhm.
lot of it, I think that the foundation of how we're going about building that is going to have a lot of long-lasting impacts in ways that we don't understand and can't anticipate yet. Um, and so I think that if we do start giving up control to the AI now, that I think that trend might continue and escalate and kind of snowball,
Yes, I
which
agree.
is not good.
Yeah.
So my last question for you, what's the one piece of red tape that you'd love to cut from how companies manage or govern their data today?
Um, I think it would be the permission to innovate. Because what I see happening a lot within an organization is that teams are not able to execute and try things out because of a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of, red tape to go with
Hmm.
the theme here, that they have to get permission from this department, they have to get approval from this particular team. So therefore, as a part of that, everyone is so busy and resource constrained that innovation often just dies, right, on a piece of paper as opposed to getting
Right.
tried. So so how would we do that? Well, one is we need to have data literacy as a must across the organization, and it should start at the top, right? So that would help us, eliminate that. When people understand why data is important, why this needs to be done, why this needs to be experimented with, this needs to be tried in a controlled environment, they'll be a bit more willing. The executives will have a, buy-in into the process. Cut the endless approvals and committees that delay progress as a result of it. So give the data organization a bit more power to try things out and make decisions in a controlled environment. Empower data owners to act with clear, obviously, guardrails in place. And then finally, just simplicity, in my opinion, beats bureaucracy. Keep
Yeah,
it simple, keep it keep people in the loop. As long as you have good communication, you can manage all of that where the executive leadership team feels comfortable, but the executing team also feels the power to execute on the things and try things out.
yeah, absolutely. No, really love that. Really appreciate it. Any last points you'd like to make today? Anything I missed?
No, the only thing I would say is, we live in an AI-driven world now, but my caution again and my recommendation again would be going back to the title of my book again is, you know, think data, right? And act AI. You need to still keep data at the forefront before you get distracted by the shiny new object, which we often do, right? There's something new, we want to try it out and we want to do it. But think about the fundamentals and think what is necessary for the AI to work, which in turn will make your jobs easier. And ultimately, if we have responsible and transparent AI, we could have a really nice companion for us to work with and be a bit more efficient versus always trying to keep an eye out. Oh, is this AI going to go wrong here? Is that AI going to cause a problem for me? So if we manage it like that, I think we could create this really good relationship between AI and the humans.
I really appreciate that. I love that, Gurpinder. Thank you so much for coming on Robots and Red Tape. I've really had a great time with you today.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And everybody, thank you so much for listening. I hope you're having a great day.